in 1973, there's this famous incident involving Jackie Gleason being taken to Homestead Air Force Base by Richard Nixon. That the president showed him the crashed UFOs and such and other devices there. And of course, Gleason went on to talk about that years later. But when Nixon and Gleason showed up at Homestead Air Force Base to be admitted, they were met by a senior Air Force officer. This is according to Clark McClelland, who was a former spacecraft operator, and he has disclosed a lot about the history of NASA, the Germans, and so forth. But he said that Gleason and Nixon were met at Homestead Air Force Base by none other than Donald Rumsfeld. That Donald Rumsfeld was the intermediary. He was the guy that would give Nixon and Gleason access to the crashed UFO material. So if Rumsfeld was a bad guy, I mean, he would never have done that. But he was given Nixon and Gleason access to stuff that others within the control system probably wouldn't have wanted to happen, because Gleason was famous at the time.
I concur. And also, if I might add, that it was Rumsfeld who came forward publicly the day before 9/11 and announced that something like $3.5 trillion was missing from the Pentagon.
You are listening to Exopolitics Today with Dr. Michael Salla, your source for the uncensored truth regarding the human, extraterrestrial, global, and political agenda. Click the like button and subscribe to this channel. And now, here's Dr. Michael Salla.
Well, I want to welcome Andy Basiago again to Exopolitics Today. Andy has been with us once before and introduced us to the Project Pegasus that he went through as a child in the 1960s. And so there's a lot of kind of issues to still touch on, and there's more to Andy's story. So I want to welcome you to the show, Andy.
Good to be back with you, Michael. You know, it occurred to me when we last spoke that in fact the previous time we had appeared together was at the MUFON Symposium, which I believe was in July of 2017. And from left to right, it was myself, yourself, and then the great William Tompkins, the estimable Corey Good, and then the brilliant Richard Dolan on the right. That was a great panel that we had.
That was a really fascinating panel, and I think it is available. Maybe I'll have to dig for the URL for that, so that if people want to find that and listen to that. Very interesting. And kind of like highlighted the different methodologies that people are debating over in the UFO community over, sources and vetting and credibility and all of that. So very interesting, because all 5 people on that panel just came from very different positions on that. But one of the things that we did touch on in the last interview was that during one of your time travel experiments, you were taken to the year 2045, and I think you mentioned it, but you actually didn't describe what you saw there. And I think you said something about, being indoors, but, people wanted to know, well, what else did you experience into that trip into the future for kind of remote or for time travel intelligence gathering?
Well, what they did is, at the end of the school year in 1972, which was the end of my 5th grade year, they told all of the children in Pegasus, I believe it was Jack Pruitt, that we were all going to be, sent out of the program, separated from the program, that they would never talk to us again, and if they were ever asked whether we were in the program or the program existed, they would state that they had never heard of us and that the program never existed. But then they called back some of us for that summer. Now, the whole thrust of that summer were Stargate voyages to the year 2045, which they had selected because it was 100 years after the advent of atomic weapons, 1945. In other words, they had created sort of a time travel-based staging base 100 years from the end of World War II. And that particular device was on the Olympic-sized basketball court at the Cerrillos Cultural Center. Now, behind that, to the right, there was a symphony orchestra stage where they had placed the chronovisor that they used to send me in the summer of 1971 8 times to Ford's Theater to see who shot President Lincoln. And it always changed a little bit. But by summer of 1972, they had shut that down. Now, the Stargate was essentially this huge black anvil-shaped device going all the way up to the ceiling of this Olympic basketball-sized court. And we would run up a ramp and go through essentially a large teleporter, not with the elliptical booms like the one back at Curtiss-Wright or in New Jersey or the one at the Sandia National Labs, northeast of Albuquerque, New Mexico, but basically just this big black anvil. And we had been trained to sort of conserve our oxygen by sort of sipping it off the top of our lungs. And I think I've had a minor respiratory problem, at least with hyperventilation ever since. But as I think I mentioned on last month's show with you, that because I had played alto saxophone for 3 years by 1972, that really wasn't that much of a challenge to me to be able to just sort of sip the air, because it took 30 seconds to, after going through the Stargate, to get from 1972 to the year 2045. Now, when we got there, we were essentially on a plaza, and I could see different buildings. I could see gentlemen driving those Sedgway or IT devices that Dean Kamen invented, driving paperwork and mail and stuff between buildings. But there seemed to be some reduction in population, at least in that location. It was somewhere, I think in the American Southwest, it was somewhat more temperate than the towns in that area of our country were that I knew in 1972. I mean, it was not as hot, it was not as dry as Albuquerque or Santa Fe or Phoenix, Arizona, and so forth, all towns that I had visited. And I would always be popped back into view after jumping through the Stargate, and it was called a Stargate. I think the use of the term Stargate in the remote viewing program might have been disinformation. I've talked about what I call the high-sci disinformation ploy of just talking about remote viewing, which is something that we were doing for the Office of Naval Intelligence as early as fall of 1969, but never discussing the chronovisors that were also part of that program. So we were using a Stargate. That's what it was called. That's what we were trained on. In fact, we had to go through this catapult just to get used to being propelled through time-space so quickly and suddenly, and so violently, if you will. And then we'd pop into view somewhere between right in front of the building to about a mile from it. We'd have to walk there. There was a sort of a plaza that we would walk along. Now, when we got there, it was a beautiful tungsten building with emerald-colored glass, and we'd go towards the door, and it would open automatically. And inside this office, which presumably was some sort of CIA or other intel agency building in the future, they didn't tell us where or what year it was. We only found out it was 2045 when some of their technicians were sent back to our time to fix the device. And they said to us, you kids don't know what year we're from? We're from 2045. You weren't told that? We said, well, thank you very much, gentlemen. They weren't supposed to tell us. So anyway, we would go in there, and I would meet with this middle-aged employee, and he would explain to us how he was going to be giving us these microfilm summaries of events falling between 1972 and 2045. Now, we were never shown those. We were just shown the microfilm itself by Jack Pruitt back in 1972. He took it out of the capsule and it was like 300 feet of film all over the floor. But it was essentially all encrypted. It was basically different histograms, bar graphs and numbers and images. So I never found out what we were faring back from the future to the present. But it was essentially made clear to us that we were giving the Department of Defense a history of the future to prevent nuclear war and achieve other important goals of our country.
Were you told
so
anything? Were you given any details about that future? What happened around 2045?
No, except because I was the son of a project principal, and I was involved in many of the important project activities that were going on. I would hear them talking about different things that did fall between 1972 and the future. I heard about 9/11 and exactly what was going to happen on 9/11. I heard about the advent of the internet. I heard about the advent of HIV/AIDS as a pandemic that would kill people as a result of sexual activity. I heard about the Bushes, George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush being president, Bill Clinton and Barack Obama being among our future presidents. I heard of the sort of commonality of the cell phone revolution that would occur, because my dad said we saw all of you walking around with these little walkie-talkies, so mobile phones are going to be a big deal. So I pretty much learned about some of the information that they were bringing back from the future, but we were not being briefed. We were just errands who were going there and then coming back. And I had to be age progressed from around age 10 to midlife, age 45 or 50. And they told me it was something to do with genetics, that even though it was healthier for children to be sent to the future with less chances of medical side effects, they still were going to age progress me. So before I even went to 2045 via Stargate, they put me in this box like a phone booth at the Sandia National Labs, and some kind of technical process was involved on me that actually cast me sort of holographically about a mile into the streetscape there in Albuquerque, and I had to find my way back to Sandia. And when I did, I walked into a meeting, and my dad snapped his fingers and said, "That's my son." And what was he looking at? He was looking at his youngest son out of 3 out of 5 children, who looked a lot like him at midlife. As Courtney Hunt of both Project Pegasus and Project Mars once said to me, yeah, it was pretty much a joke on the project that you were a clone of your dad. You look so much alike. So my dad basically saw a slightly younger, he was like 47, 48 in 1971, 72. Actually, he was, 49? And I come through the door at Sandia National Labs, and it's sort of a 45-year-old version of him. But it's his 10-year-old who's been age progressed. I then had to live for about 3.5 weeks in a medical lab at Sandia with extremely high walls so that nobody would see that I had been age progressed, not regressed. Not 20 years and back, but just 20, years. But
can you explain a little bit about how that age progression process works? I mean, what kind of technology was used? And, I mean, is it just... exactly. What technology is used and what consciousness? I mean, are we talking about a 10-year-old in the body of a 45-year-old, or is something... Does something happen?
Yeah. They never explained these esoteric activities to me, but they basically put me in what looked like a phone booth. And they said, okay, Andy, when we turn this on, you're going to be about 45, 50 years physically. But we know you're going to be cast out of Sandia here. So just ask questions from people or whoever you meet, police officers on the street or whoever, and say, how do I get to the Sandia National Labs? Which I did. So I basically was somehow not just age progressed, but cast away from Sandia. Now, how that came together, I don't know, but it could have been that point of the fact that by the future, there's going to be a dislocation of locations that you time travel from. So they did that, and my dad met with me and his colleagues, and they took me to this medical lab. So they didn't tell me how it worked, but I was in a meeting with my dad and about 3 or 4 of his colleagues, not really gentlemen that I knew, but I could tell they were on the project. And Sandia was a place, of course, I knew, because we had been teleporting back to New Jersey from a teleport on the first, well, really the only floor, it was a ground floor complex, over on the right side of the second building. And they were long linear buildings. And I was placed in this medical lab, and I was given 3 books: The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck, Moby Dick by Herman Melville, and The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. And I read all 3 of those. My dad had explained to me, don't worry, son, you just have to live in this room for the next 3.5 weeks, and a nice lady will be coming by to give you breakfast, lunch, and dinner. You're going to be fed like a king, so don't worry. And I basically had a bed, a sink, and a commode, and that was it. And that's where I stayed. And there was a mirror, and I saw myself as a 45 or a 50-year-old with all of the physical attributes of a grown man. And I, of course, had not yet gone through adolescence. I was only 10 in summer of 1972, not yet even 11. And I could see in the mirror that I was like my dad, with all the attributes of a grown man. And then it just wore off. I was never age regressed. But as a result of that experience, when I heard the account of Michael C. Ralph in 1999, I would defer to your memories, but I think that was the first account of 20 years and back. You know, the idea of age, of somebody spending 20 years in the secret space program and then being regressed biologically 20 years and then sent back in time 20 years and then discharged from the program. I said, well, that didn't happen to me, but I was age progressed. And I saw the effect wearing off for 3 weeks. And so that must have been possible 25 years later. You know,
so the actual process of age progression, I mean, you went into this telephone box sized apparatus and you were just projected somewhere else in that Sandia National Laboratory area there, and while you were kind of projected to another location, you were also age progressed. So it was just like almost instantaneous. Is that what happened?
Well, see, when my biological age was changed from around 10 and a half to, they said it would be around 45 or 50 years of age. I did not time travel, because when I walked back from the streetscape of Albuquerque, New Mexico, to the Sandia National Labs, it was still summer of 1972. So this was just a biological treatment I was getting before they then would involve me in the Stargate probes to 2045. And they made that quite clear, that we're just sort of capacitating you biologically so that when you get to 2045, you will have experienced getting to the age you're going to be after the year 2000. You know, more around what, in 2021 I was 60, so 2011 I was 50. So around to the age you would be at in 2011 before going to 2045. So there was something they knew biologically about the risk to us of going 75 years from 1972 to 2045. And it was just sort of a progression with them letting the effect wear off, and then they sent me physically to 2045.
Well, I know that with the age regression technique that Michael Ralph, Corey Good, and Randy Kramer described, they all said pretty much the same thing, that they, after the completion of their 20-year service, that they were put into some stasis chamber, fed a whole cocktail of drugs, and they were there for 2 weeks or something, and that's how they were age regressed. But in your case, your age progressed about 30 years, or 35 years in age. Your age progressed through this device, and then it just wears off. There's nothing else needed.
Exactly. And so when I heard about Michael's claims in 1999, saying he had been I'd gotten the 20 years and back after serving until 1996. I thought, wow, that was 24 years after they age progressed me. It certainly seems to me like 20 years and back, or basically service for 20 years followed by age regression of 20 years and time traveling back 20 years would have been possible. Because look, they had, 70 to 75 years in the future after age progressing me and letting it wear off, and then jumping back from 2045 to 1972. So I thought to myself, and others, I remember mentioning it to E. Francis Lorgat, who I think had informed me about Michael C. Ruff's claims, that would certainly seem to be within the developmental timeline of what I was exposed to in the early 70s, because there was a good quarter century to allow what Michael C. Ruff and then later others were reporting.
And was that age progression also intended so that when you go into the future, 2045, that people there would take you seriously rather than being a 10-year-old?
After they age progressed me to midlife, they let it wear off, so I was 10 and a half again. So when I went to 2045, I was my childhood self again. And in fact, these two ladies, an African-American lady and a Caucasian lady, walked diagonally across my path as I was walking through the lobby of the building. And a woman said, "Oh, that one, that's Andy. That one must be Andy." So they knew from my future prominence, I guess, with my book about Pegasus and other public activities that I was destined to live, that this was the child version of me. It would be like saying, "Oh, there's the 10-year-old Willie Mays. Hey, there's the say, hey kid at age 10. I was a child when the effect wore off, and then we started jumping to 2045.
I see. And in 2045, was there any kind of noticeable differences in terms of technology or the people from 1972?
The technology, there were appreciable differences. Like I noticed that there were sort of flat screens that were on a posted to the desks. One thing that really struck me, and I've shared with others, is that this office was crammed with houseplants, more than you would ever see in a modern office building. It was almost as if they were making up for some loss of oxygen in our atmosphere by cramming the office with houseplants. Now, they gave us these canisters that we had to essentially insert as a suppository before jumping back to the present in 1972. And that would be the grounds around the Lobo Overlook site, which is 3 miles up elevation, right on the western side of the Continental Divide sign on Highway 160 as you go north of Pagosa Springs, Colorado, towards Colorado Springs. You hit the Great Divide, the Continental Divide, and there's a little sign on the left that says Lobo Overlook, 3 miles, and it goes up elevation for 3 miles, and then you come out and there are these 100 massive antennae. It's an area that time travel experiencers have come to call Montauk Southwest. It was the one featured in Packing for Mars by Frank Jacob and Tanya Maidenford that I'm featured in. And so that's where they were taking us back from 2045. We then had to go into the restroom, remove the canister, which had been deposited as a suppository, pull on the string, take the canister, and then bury it somewhere on the grounds of that complex. And I don't know how they would find those little canisters. They must have some metal detector or something they would use, because we were instructed to just bury them on site. And I think that what they explained, that was so they would sort of cut off those in the future providing the information and those who were going to be collecting it. But it was explained to us that was what was called in the intelligence community a dead drop. So we were burying those canisters in the site there on the Lobo Overlook site. In fact, I think if somebody went up there today with a metal detector or just arbitrarily started digging holes, they might find one of those canisters. But if they did, it would just be microfilm of 1970s vintage with a bunch of encrypted information, so it really wouldn't prove anything but my claims. It wouldn't reveal what they knew about the future. But, as I said, as a result of my father being a principal on the project and his colleagues always pumping him for what he knew, or he always having conversations with John Alexander McCone, the former director of Central Intelligence, and others, Donald Rumsfeld, who was the defense attaché to the project, and others, I learned a lot about what the future held. But, when you have childhood memories like this, and something like 9/11 happens 30 years later, it's hard to go, oh, yes, that's what they told me about 30 years ago. It's just kind of lost in the time stream, as it were.
Well, you mentioned Donald Rumsfeld, and I know he was a critical figure in the Project Pegasus, and certainly in terms of someone that you had extensive dealings with. So let's talk about him. Now, what we know about him is that he was firstly a congressman, and actually I think even during the in the 1950s, I think he was with the Navy Reserves. So I think he reached a senior rank. I think he reached the rank of captain in the Navy Reserves, as I recall. And then, of course, he served in the US Congress. But around 1969, which is around the time you began Project Pegasus officially, he is now working in the Nixon White House, a number of positions, but ends up being a counselor to President Nixon. So this was the perfect cover for him being involved in these covert projects. So, tell us about Rumsfeld and his involvement with Project Pegasus.
Yes. Rumsfeld had served as a pilot for the Navy during the Korean conflict. And I remember, in fact, him talking about lining up enemy combatants down below and then going by with his plane, bam, 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 shooting foreign combatants. I have a clear image of him years before Jack Palance did it during the Academy Awards one year, doing one-handed push-ups. It was down at, I believe, a hotel that we were at a reception at in downtown Albuquerque. I clearly remember an incident in which my father and I went into a bar. Now, my dad did not let me drink. He would always have me have a Coca-Cola or a Great Knee-High. And we went into a bar in Albuquerque, and he said, "So, Rummy, can I order you a drink?" And he said, "No way." He always had that dry way of talking like Henry Fonda. He said, "No way, I've got my martini. As long as I've got my martini, I'm fine." And my father and I sat down at the bar across from him and said, "Well, on this program, we need a drink now and again, don't we, Rummy?" And he said, "I know, Ray. Sometimes I wake up and I say to myself, are we really sending little children in time? And it's hard to even believe." But then I think, well, my God, we are. Another time, I remember being then at that meeting in that bar, my dad said, he let out a couple pauses, a little rope, and then he said, "Rummy, we've determined in the program that you make defense secretary." And Don Rumsfeld said, "I know, Ray, I saw that in one of the reports, but that's one event in the future that I'll only believe if it happens." Another time, I remember I called him Rummy, and he said, "No, Andy, call me Don. I don't want the kids in the program calling me Rummy, getting in trouble with alcohol." I remember another time we went into another eatery or bar, and he said, "So, Rummy, what are we going to be doing?" And he said, "Well, we're planning to send the kids on to the Naval Academy and use that as a pretext for involving them in future project activities." Another time I remember they were saying, "So, Rummy, are you using the program to fool around?" And he said, "Nope, gentlemen." And they said, "Why not? You have the opportunity to teleport here, do what you want in your downtime, and then teleport back to the day you left. So why aren't you using it to have an extramarital affair while you're here, even to deal with the years of separation from your wife and your normal life while you're here?" Nobody's really complaining about that type of activity. Essentially, of these adults in Project Pegasus taking mistresses while they were there in quantum displacement, New Mexico. And he said, "Nope, gentlemen." And they said, "Why not?" He said, "I love my wife." And so one of the points I've been making about actual service in these classified defense projects, as distinguished from sort of the post-Vietnam syndrome of always condemning our alphabet agencies and the Defense Department and the people like my father and Donald Rumsfeld, who were principals in those projects, is the view that you get of them as human beings is often quite different than the way they're vilified. For example, there was actually a tribunal that tried Bush, Cheney, and Rumsfeld for war crimes. And let me tell you, Michael, the Donald Rumsfeld that I met as a child was a very good person. He was very moral. As I said, he even told me not to call him Rummy because it might be viewed as a reference to alcoholism. He defended his marital vows and his love for his wife. That's very beautiful, very ethical.
That is, and I just want to kind of focus on that a little bit, because I know people have been very skeptical and said, well, Rumsfeld, how come Andy said Rumsfeld was a honorable person? I mean, wasn't he scum? Wasn't he the guy that got us into Iraq? And I just wanted to kind of focus on that aspect, because he has been clearly vilified, but I know he's actually played some very important roles in disclosure. For example, in 1973, there's this famous incident involving Jackie Gleason being taken to Homestead Air Force Base by Richard Nixon. That the president showed him the crashed UFOs and such and other devices there. And of course, Gleason went on to talk about that years later. But when Nixon and Gleason showed up at Homestead Air Force Base to be admitted, they were met by a senior Air Force officer. This is according to Clark McClelland, who was a former spacecraft operator, and he has disclosed a lot about the history of NASA, the Germans, and so forth. But he said that Gleason and Nixon were met at Homestead Air Force Base by none other than Donald Rumsfeld. That Donald Rumsfeld was the intermediary. He was the guy that would give Nixon and Gleason access to the crashed UFO material. So if Rumsfeld was a bad guy, I mean, he would never have done that. But he was given Nixon and Gleason access to stuff that others within the control system probably wouldn't have wanted to happen, because Gleason was famous at the time.
I concur. And also, if I might add, that it was Rumsfeld who came forward publicly the day before 9/11 and announced that something like $3.5 trillion was missing from the Pentagon. Why would a villain have done that if he was part of the deep state rather than simply an ethical person serving in important positions like the American to serve the most number of days as Secretary of Defense under Presidents Gerald Ford and George W. Bush? Why would he have done that? He would have concealed it on behalf of the deep state. So all I'm saying is, as a kid from Morris Plains, New Jersey, where I was friends, with Jimmy the mailman, and I was naturally and even trained in reading adults and animals and whoever I might encounter time traveling, I got a good vibe from Don Rumsfeld. He was a trustworthy, moral person. Now, there was a meeting with him that was critical. I think the most important thing that I did with Rumsfeld is sometime in 1971, I believe it was fall of 71, we met in this underground auditorium or kind of room, lecture room, that was one floor below ground in the Cerritos Cultural Center where the Stargate ultimately would be. Now, I did find that in the early 1980s that floor burned off when the Sarkeesian family owned the Cerritos Cultural Center. And today you can see that meeting chamber as almost sort of an amphitheater from the surface of the ground out, as if you go over the wall of the Cerritos Cultural Center, you can see sort of this amphitheater, which is just the ruins of this underground amphitheater that Rumsfeld lectured us in. And he said to us that we had to keep the time travel devices we were being exposed to absolutely secret because national security depended on it. And he said the primary purpose of teleportation is military. It's going to allow us to put troops precisely where they're needed on the battlefield. So Rumsfeld was pretty much immersed in the goals of the Defense Department. So I think if somebody has problems with war, then he might be viewed as a villain. But if you embrace the doctrine of just war, and there are times when we have to stand up to tyrants just to preserve our own lives, which many religious faiths have actually stated is proper to wage just war, for example, in self-defense or defense of others, then maybe he's not a villain. It just really comes down to how you view war. But he was definitely an apparatchik of the U.S. Defense Department, and I felt that he and many of the other men I was meeting on the project, that, like my father, were individuals who had seen, had gone to hell and back during World War II, and they were just trying to prevent the future wars and all future wars, because, as Grenville Clark had informed that generation, if we did have a World War III, World War IV would be fought with sticks and stones. So they were really concerned about preserving peace and even engaging in limited war of a conventional nature to prevent an all-out thermonuclear war. That was my impression. And by the way, Dr. Harold Agnew, who was the Federal Science Administrator of Project Pegasus, who was essentially the quintessential Manhattan Project physicist, gave interviews even in the 1980s about the need to prevent nuclear war. So that culture was not a genocidal culture that wanted to use atomic bombs to blow everything up, but quite the contrary, to prevent a mass disaster of that kind.
Well, one of the things that you already mentioned was the 9/11 event, and that you had gotten intelligence about that in 1971 with one of these excursions into the future, maybe from 2045, in terms of what was brought back by you and your team or the others. Now, you mentioned, of course, Rumsfeld's involvement in that. So Rumsfeld and you have that affidavit that you've put out, and with that Rumsfeld and others knew that 9/11 was going to happen. Now, of course, we know that one day before 9/11, Rumsfeld gave that extraordinary press conference where he revealed, I think it was, $2.1 trillion was missing from the Pentagon budget. And he actually attacked the Pentagon bureaucracy as America's greatest enemy. And that was very interesting that he was attacking the bureaucracy, because they were blocking some of the innovations that Rumsfeld was wanting the Pentagon to adopt, which included the creation of a Space Corps. So that was back in the year, so on September 10, 2001, Rumsfeld, because the Pentagon was blocking a lot of advanced projects, including the creation of a Space Corps, he gives this press conference. And then, of course, the next day, everything gets buried because of 9/11. So, yeah, what can you kind of elaborate about that sequence of events and Rumsfeld's involvement in 9/11, or advanced knowledge of it, exposing the Pentagon, missing money?
Well, I know this. I know that I was in New Mexico in 1971 when my dad received a phone call at the restaurant known as the La Hacienda. His old friend Maria Constancia Chavez, or Connie Chavez, also known as Pilly Chavez, that was her nickname, Pilly, gave him a phone, just a standard, restaurant rotary phone. And he said, "Let's go, son." And then my dad sped down from Old Town Albuquerque to Socorro, New Mexico. And we went into a C-shaped Aerojet Corporation facility that was then on the northern side of the grounds of the New Mexico Institute of Science and Technology, also known as New Mexico Tech. There on the corner of Bullock and Leroy Place, there was a Masonic Lodge, but then there was the Research Library of New Mexico Tech, and there was this small V-shaped building with a zero-scape landscape and about a parking lot that accommodated about 20 vehicles. My dad parked the car, got down there very fast. He must have been speeding at about 90 miles per hour because it took about an hour to get the 90 miles from Albuquerque to Socorro. And we go through the middle of the building, and he flashes his badge to the guard in the center of the building and says, "My son's going with me." And we walk through these bars open up on the left side and allow us into the left side of the building. And this young postdoc working for Dr. Sterling Colgate, who was variously the president and the dean of physics at New Mexico Tech, comes into the hallway and says, Ray, you're not going to believe it. We finally got it. We've got images of the event that's going to be known as 9/11. So we go further into the left side of the Aerojet Corporation facility there, where those graduate students in physics working for Dr. Sterling Colgate, that'd be interesting to search out those names, were essentially analyzing images from the future, like the ones I was taking back by summer of 72 from 2045. But here in 1971, they already had footage from some sort. It might have been technological imaging from our present into the future. And they had inside this room, they had about 20 television sets, or VDTs as they were known, video display terminals. And the young postdoc or graduate student working for Sterling Colgate kept on showing one of the planes hitting one of the towers, and then he would reverse it and let it happen again and go bam. And my dad was just stupefied. And then when we saw enough of that, he just said, well, thank you very much, gentlemen, and we drove back to Albuquerque. So during other experiences, then and later, I heard my dad talking about 9/11. And so I don't have direct evidence that Donald Rumsfeld was briefed on 9/11, but as I stated in my affidavit before the Vancouver 911 Tribunal on 9/11/2012, it really goes beyond the possible to assume that the defense attaché for Project Pegasus did not know about the ultimate event to be known as 9/11. If my father knew about it, if I and my father saw images of it, which was really, the South Tower strike, and if it was spoken of openly in the program, it had to be something that had been shared with Mr. Rumsfeld at least in the early 70s before 9/11. So I've taken the position that, well, there's a couple ways of interpreting this. One is that he literally knew on the day of the attacks that this was expected on some September 11th. Another possibility is that he knew to a scientific certainty that it was going to be happening. That would explain why, for example, the FBI agent John O'Neill took up residence in the Twin Towers. Another possibility is it was something shared with him in the 70s, and it was not within his contemplation that morning. And when it happened, he then went out and helped people escape the Pentagon. I don't know. I don't know that Donald Rumsfeld was literally expecting that event on that day, but I think that that's a possibility that should be explored.
Well, I think
certainly the project knew about it.
Well, there's that circumstantial evidence of that foreknowledge was the press conference he gave on September 10, where he revealed those incredible details about just how much money was missing from the Pentagon, and that the greatest enemy that the American people face is the Pentagon bureaucracy. Why would a Secretary of Defense say that America's greatest enemy is the Pentagon bureaucracy? Was he really alluding to the secret government? And I guess, and I just want to throw something out and get you to respond to that. Was he, in that speech referring to the Pentagon bureaucracy as America's greatest enemy, was he signaling his frustration over the fact that he wasn't able to stop what the people in the covert programs knew was going to happen on September 11, that there were others that knew that there was going to be this kind of like attack, and that it had inside support, and so he was frustrated that he couldn't stop it, and so maybe that's why he gave his press conference. So yeah, that's my speculation. I just want to get you to respond.
That would be my assessment as a graduate in American history who went on to be admitted at the federal level in this country and then run for president. That would be my assessment. That what you're suggesting is that Rumsfeld's speech on September 10th of 2001 was essentially sort of the second stroke of Eisenhower's farewell address, where he discussed the threat posed by the military-industrial complex. I think that that's a fair assessment, and because he was an ethical man who was even stating that he loved his wife and therefore would never engage in an extramarital affair and betray her, and he was always nice to me, I knew him as a friendly, nice American, not as some villain or ogre. And he also was working on survival and peace in the nuclear age. So I think he was concerned that things had transmogrified into something even more serious after Eisenhower's farewell address of 1961.
Well, I agree. I think that Eisenhower's farewell address of 1961 and Rumsfeld's speech on September 10, 2001, which few people know about or even acknowledge, that they are very similar in identifying that who the greatest enemy of the American people is concerned. And the one thing that I found during my research for one of my books, that is Space Force, Our Star Trek Future, that came out in 2021, was that Donald Rumsfeld was the guy that chaired the Space Commission in 2000 that had been convened by Congress to make recommendations in terms of space and the future. And he was strongly in favor of creating a Space Corps, which today is known as Space Force because that was set up in 2019. But it wasn't Donald Trump who actually was the one that first proposed the creation of a Space Force. It was actually this Space Commission that Donald Rumsfeld chaired back in the year 2000. And his proposal for a Space Corps was actually blocked by the Pentagon bureaucracy, which is why I think he was so angry and why he came out with that speech attacking the Pentagon bureaucracy. And the end result was that rather than creating a Space Corps that would deal with future threats faced by the US, that was put on the ice for 19 years until Donald Trump came on the scene. And it was because there were people that didn't want America to develop a Space Corps. And I think the reason Rumsfeld wanted to do it was that he wanted to white world the black programs in terms of secret space programs. That because he worked with different servicemen in those and people like you in the covert programs, that he wanted such people to get recognition, and the creation of a Space Corps in 2001 would have been a way to kind of bring those covert space programs or chrononaut programs, like in your case, into the public arena and people to be given recognition.
Right. He also knew we were going to be cheated because he had quantum access information about the fact that I was going to be cheated of all of my pay for both Project Pegasus and Project Mars, all of my benefits. And he had seen something I would write in the future where I complained about him having 6 houses or something. He said to me, "Andy, I want you to know I've worked for everything I have, every cent of it." He was kind of angry, and that was like when I went back to New Mexico in the first summer of '71. And so I think that apropos of sort of the view of Rumsfeld you're presenting, my dad was a Republican from a small town in Pennsylvania. So he was fairly conservative, I wouldn't say reactionary, but conservative. And yet he supported and voted for Presidents John F. Kennedy and Harry S. Truman, because he always voted for the man rather than for the party. And he believed that Donald Rumsfeld would have made a fine president. And that kind of corresponded to the positive impression that Mr. Rumsfeld made on me as a child. So I think these kinds of actions that he took were consistent. And another thing I might add is that in contemporary America, because of the post-Vietnam syndrome, if you will, everybody is always referring to different intelligence agencies and military departments and even corporations and churches and other organizations in a monolithic way. But people forget that within every human heart, every family, every town, every organization, there are good and bad people and good and bad impulses. And in that sense, the battle between good and evil is going on all the time at the level of our own hearts. And so people will presuppose that everybody working for the CIA or everybody working for the Department of Defense is a warmonger or an apparatchik of the deep state. And that is just not true. That's one of the reasons I've spoken out. When I came forward publicly in 2004, I was advised by Virginia Olds, somebody I hadn't met in 30 years, who was a CIA agent on Project Pegasus, that because I was not giving my lectures with that sort of characteristic post-Vietnam cynicism about the CIA, the DIA, DARPA, and the rest, that I was gaining a lot of support within the intelligence community. But she also warned me that not everybody in the U.S. intelligence community supported me coming forward, and literally told me where I was then living was safe from an assassination risk. So I've tried to contextualize the fact that within the U.S. intelligence community Defense Department, there are people who've been favoring disclosure and those who've been willing to assassinate people to prevent disclosure. It's been a war all along. And I think that you've done a fine job today contextualizing the actual career of Donald Henry Rumsfeld in that regard, and what he ultimately tried to create that indicated he was a moral man trying to improve the situation in the different agencies and departments that he worked for.
Well, I remember in my interview with Randy Kramer, very interesting person in terms of his memories of being a part of these secret space programs. He said something, and there was another witness of a secret space program, that is Michael Gerloff, who also was someone that served in an kind of like the Space Marines. But the thing that kind of stuck in my memory was that Randy Kramer said that when he finished his 20-year and back in 2005, that he was on Lunar Operations Command. He was the first person to actually identify Lunar Operations Command as the chief base used for kind of recruitment and maintenance of secret space program operatives. He said that he went to a farewell ceremony, and he said, there were kind of like a lot of senior brass there and some VIPs there for this kind of like for the retirement of a bunch of people that had finished their 20 years in the 20 and back program. And he said that Donald Rumsfeld, who had just retired as Secretary of Defense, was there as the guest of honor, as the VIP, and he gave a speech where he said that he would do all he could to ensure that people who had served in the 20 and back would be protected in terms of their benefits and recognition and so forth. So that I remember that. that Rumsfeld kind of like gave that speech, and that it greatly impressed these people that had finished their 20 and backs, because that's the other thing I've learned. In addition to you and Randy Kramer, Michael Ralph, Corey Good, and others have all said the same thing, that after doing their 20 and back, then they're sent back and they get virtually no benefits, no assistance, even though they've served for 20 years and are entitled to kind of like the retirement benefits that any military personnel gets for serving 20 years. But they're given none of that, and in fact, life is made harder for them because they suffer PTSD. And but Rumsfeld was very much a kind of like a good guy trying to help these guys that had served in the 20 and back programs. And that's consistent with what I found in my research, that he was behind this proposal to set up a Space Corps back in 2001.
Right. I actually quantified what I was supposed to be paid and benefited with, and it comes to about $3 million. I was supposed to receive money placed in reserve, $30,000 placed in reserve to my 25th birthday. The value of that money today would be well over $250,000. When I was serving on Mars, I was supposed to receive a zero-interest loan to buy a home in Redding, California, a salary, and a cradle-to-the-grave revolving door of government service. So I'm owed several million by the U.S. government, and what I've learned from, well, Courtney M. Hunt of the CIA said that I should continue to pay my taxes and so forth and await the day when we would be paid. But I'm 60 now, and I haven't been paid for things I did for the government between age 6 and 11 and between age 19 and 22. So in several years, it'll be 40 years since I ended my government service. That'll be in 2024. It will be 40 years since I left Project Mars in 1984. And I have not been paid. Now, what apparently individuals of this status number about 50,000 Americans, according to Courtney Hunt of CIA. And what I found recently from a friend of mine who's both been on the inside looking out and the outside looking in the U.S. intelligence community, that we're known in the intelligence community as ghosts, that they intentionally shoved us off deck and didn't pay or benefit us because they wanted to keep the project secret. And I'm happy and proud of the fact that by coming forward now almost 20 years ago, I believe that I kicked off the literature of revelation that we've had of those ghosts who have been treated in this way.
Yeah, it's very important that people who have served in these covert programs are given recognition, because, yeah, it really does create a toll. And I know your health is very questionable, and you're suffering some acute problems now, and some of that is related to things that you did during the covert programs. So I just wanted...
Well, Michael, yeah, I was briefed by Chad Pruitt in 2003 that all of the children in Project Pegasus were in metabolic syndrome, and that it mimicked diabetes. And to not go on metformin or glucophage, which now, almost 20 years later, 19 years later, we know causes kidney failure, which I'm in. So, yes, I was damaged by Project Pegasus and Project Mars and not even paid. So in my worst days, my fiancée Gwen helps me cheer up, because in a sense, I view myself almost as a man without a country, in the sense that I was used even to go back to the time of Washington, to brief General Washington to retreat his troops from New York Harbor, and hence played a role in the creation of the United States. But then, after serving in 2 classified projects for it, was denied everything that my late father and I were promised. This is an injustice in the history of the American government. That was one of the things that propelled me to run for president in 2016, and needs to be righted. And they have those records. I know that. I know they have my records, because I've even joked to people, screening people at the airport for TSA. And I've said, well, if you want to run my name, you're going to find it all over alphabet agencies. And then they do that. And they say, okay, sir, you can go. And I know that, you mentioned that you found my name in the gifted and talented student documents that survive. I have put forward so many proofs of my experiences in Project Pegasus that I should be able to win in a court of law in this country, but I have not yet got a fellow practitioner to file under 42 U.S.C. 1983 for me, a so-called Bivens action, deprivation of civil liberties by a government official operating under color of authority. And that's what all participants in these classified projects who have been denied and cheated of everything they were promised, or that their families were promised, are owed by the U.S. government.
Just to go back to something you mentioned a little earlier, that is the intelligence gathering on future presidents. You mentioned Obama and Clinton as two presidents that were identified during your work with Project Pegasus. So, how did that happen, and was that all for Project Pegasus? And
well, actually, it was both projects. The first presidents that I met decades before they became president were the Bushes, George H.W. Bush and his son George W. Bush. Again, I was 10 or so, 9 or 10, and a 24-year-old or so, George W. Bush got right in my face at a reception in New Mexico for he and his father, and said, "Andy, have you heard? My dad and I are going to be president." So he was I remember that he was very florid. His dad was very reserved and conservative, very appropriate, as was Mrs. Bush. Then at a later, that was sort of a reception at a restaurant. And then at a smaller group, there was Bill Clinton on my left, and then Dr. Harold M. Agnew, the director of Project Pegasus, my father, Ivan Browning, Dr. Ivan Browning, the director of science and technology for the CIA from 1959 to 74, and then my dad's colleague at Ralph M. Parsons, a man by the name of Joe Conason. And the four adults there talking to the young Bill Clinton sitting on my left said, "So, Bill, how are you doing with the information?" And he said, "Well, fellas, I know that you're brilliant, and you're always building more destructive nuclear weapons for the atomic research community, and I know what you're telling me, but gentlemen, some days I get up and I have to pinch myself and say, me, Bill Clinton, President of the United States? Well, fellas, that dog don't hunt." And that's a direct quote. Now, when I met the Bushes and I met Bill Clinton as a child, I felt that they were good people, again, just like Mr. Rumsfeld, just like Jimmy the mailman in Morris Plains, New Jersey. And my dad and I crossed paths with Mr. Clinton again when we were crossing the country to California in November of 1972. And he was coming back to Little Rock after the defeat of his candidate, George McGovern, in the 1972 presidential election. And a friend of him was teasing him and saying, "So, Billy boy, what are you going to do now that your guy lost? What are you going to do with yourself?" And Bill Clinton came up to this gentleman walking alongside of us at the downtown Little Rock Holiday Inn parking lot. And oddly, my dad had said, "Andy, I left my camera in the car. Let's go out there and get it." And the result was we crossed paths with Bill Clinton. And he said, "Well, actually, I'm going to go back to law school and finish out, and I'm going to come back here and run for Congress. And I want to ask you, Bill," or whatever the guy's name was, or Harry, "do I have your vote?" And he started shaking the guy's hand and laughing. So we had that encounter with Bill Clinton in New Mexico right after he'd been briefed about his future presidency. And then about a year later, we had an episode where we walked past Bill Clinton, and he made this reference to his future first journey into politics by running for Congress in Arkansas. So I don't know whether that was planned or just a coincidence, but it was the same individual. And what was strange about that meeting, or passing of Bill Clinton, was I saw kind of these waves of energy coming off of him across the tarmac there at the Macadam parking lot around the downtown Little Rock Holiday Inn. And I don't know how that connected to his destiny, but I picked up a strong, energetic pattern from Bill Clinton both times, both in New Mexico and then in Arkansas. And again, my dad didn't say, look, we've got to run to that young man who's going to be president that we met back in New Mexico. But then when I asked him in the late 80s who future presidents were, he did mention Bill Clinton, that young man who gave that long speech at the 1988 DNC, and then George W. Bush, the son of Vice President Bush, and then even an African American, a black president, and he couldn't remember Obama's name. He said something like Brick Obanja. That was in 1989. Well, the strange thing about that is we had been trained with Barack Obama in the summer of 1980.
Well, before we go to that training with Barack Obama, I just wanted to kind of like back up something you said about George Bush Sr. and Jr. You felt that they were good people, because I know that there's going to be listeners who are going to really take umbrage at that, and certainly George Bush Sr. I mean, it's known that he was the guy that set up the Zapruder oil company as a front to Zapata, yeah, to set up Zapata as a front for collecting a bunch of assassins that would assassinate Fidel Castro, but then after the Bay of Pigs, that they were repurposed to assassinate an American VIP. And of course, there's that infamous document that shows, that CIA document, or was it an FBI document, that shows that George Bush Sr. was actually present in Dallas during the Kennedy assassination, and many people say that he was actually running the Zapata hit team that had now been repurposed to kill Kennedy. So he seems to have been truly a creature of the deep state. But
my take on that, Michael, is I'm aware of all those assertions. All I'm saying is I was a kid on the project, and I'm not committing what historiography is known as a presentist evaluation of the past. All I'm saying is that as a kid on the project, he was not a creepy adult. In fact, there was occasionally off-color humor. Even his own young son was engaging in some. And he said, I don't want to hear that. Don't go there. You've got kids present. So when I hear stories like the assertion that George H.W. Bush was a pedophile and so forth, I discount it, because he was actually policing people on the project to be appropriate around the children on the project. And I was a child when I met the Bushes. I never met them when I was older. If, in fact, he was complicit in the assassination of President Kennedy, then my conclusion would be shared with others, that he's a villain, an evil man. But I don't have that evidence. I just have the evidence of what I felt and witnessed when I met him. And that's something that I'm trying to urge people to do. We only know what we experience, and then we only have, experience trumps knowledge, and knowledge trumps information, and information trumps data. And a lot of what's been happening is that data has been accelerated from knowledge into almost what people regard as experience. And that's just not valid. So, for example, I hear things asserted about people. There were all kinds of false claims asserted about me when I came forward, and then when I ran for president. And I know that there's just a pattern that's going on in this country. It could be from a foreign power, where very good people are being vilified. And I think we have to keep an eye on that. But all I'm saying is that the Bushes I met were nice people. The the Rumsfeld I met was a nice person. I'm just bearing witness to my experience.
Well, and I do want to kind of like say that there's a book written by Ronald Kessler who interviewed Secret Service agents for a number of US presidents. And these Secret Service agents pointed out that George Bush and Barbara Bush were really nice people, that they treated, especially Barbara Bush, that they treated the Secret Service agents with great respect and dignity and would kind of like look out for them. And I think that was the same with George W. Bush and Laura Bush. And interestingly, Ronald Kessler in his book said that Jimmy Carter and Al Gore were complete assholes in terms of how they treated Secret Service agents. So, it kind of shows that, because the thing is, in terms of UFO research, we look at people like Jimmy Carter and Al Gore as being kind of like good guys because they were kind of like trying to bring out disclosure, or they were associated with positive policies, but at a personal level, they were complete assholes. And similarly, I think it's quite possible that works the other way around too, that people like George Herbert Walker Bush did set up the Zapata company that was used for the Kennedy assassination, but he was doing a job for the CIA covert operations, and these people regard themselves as patriots, and from their perspective, even though I strongly disagree with it, from their perspective, Kennedy was a bad guy that needed to be eliminated, and so they considered themselves to be kind of patriots. And
well, maybe after they found his presidential daily brief in the Kremlin, they concluded that he had actually betrayed the country. I'm not going to justify the Kennedy assassination, but I would look at it this way, Michael. I've been a lifelong Democrat. I first worked for Hubert H. Humphrey of Minnesota for president in 1968 when I was 7 years old. I went door to door in Morris Plains, New Jersey, calling for his election, asking people to support him. And I've been a Democrat my whole life. I'm now 60. But what I've experienced is, as indicated what you just observed about the Bushes and then the actual treatment by Mr. Gore and Mr. Carter of their Secret Service protectors, is that Democrats tend to lionize people for their Wilsonian idealism. Republicans often are doing right by people. Scripture teaches that by their acts shall you know them. And when I look back at my 60 years, most of the time I've been helped in a material way, it's been by Republicans. Most of the time I've been agreed with about my ideal, it's been Democrats. And what I was trying to do in my 100 proposals when I ran for president in 2016 is bring together those two styles of American politics, where we are not only concerned about maintaining the high ideals of Democrats, but doing right by other people in our everyday lives, like so many Republicans have constantly shown me. Because I think that Scripture is right. It's true. By their acts shall you know them. And I've known very principled Republicans despite my membership in the Democratic Party. And then when I've come into rough periods of my life where I really need help, as I did when I lost my vision, well, who helped me? One of my brothers, a lifelong Republican. When I got the opportunity to make substantial money as a lawyer, who was I working for? Republicans who were trying to spread the wealth. So I think we have to kind of bring together Wilsonian idealism and Reaganism to actually heal the country. But I do think that in addition to that, there's a couple of other things going on. One is there's a paranoid style of American politics in which simply untrue claims are being made about good people who are serving our country. Another pattern, I think, but I can't prove it, is that there is foreign intelligence working to attack what I call the original CIA. That is, charismatic individual American. And that could be a KGB Russian program or other sort of conspiracies by those who want to damage the country. And that's why I'm urging everybody to sit back and say, wait a minute, do you know this about this person? Or is this just an assertion being made about this person on the internet? Does it even meet the tests of modern university history? And often it doesn't. It's just what the law calls mere assertion.
Well, I want to move on to something else concerning time travel. And Al Bielek, he gave a number of interviews talking about the origins of time travel, which kind of differs to the origins that you've described. So I just wanted to get your response. Al Bielek said that US time travel really took off in 1936 when there was an incident involving the USS Kearsarge, which was doing some deep drilling or doing some deep sea operations in the Bermuda Triangle area, and it interacted with a crystal, an Atlantean crystal, that took it into the future, and that the Kearsarge went into the future. The whole ship went there, disappeared, went into the future, got some information from the future US Navy, which presumably was the 1970s or 80s, and then went back with information about time travel. And that's when the US Navy's time travel projects began, and that eventually it perfected time travel, where the Navy could move ships back and forward in time, and that was used to win the Second World War. That the US Navy in the Second World War was being helped by the US Navy from the 1970s and 80s with advanced weapons, some nuclear technology to win the Second World War. So yeah, I just wanted to get your feedback on that.
Right. I interviewed Al Bielek in 2005. By then, I had been actively investigating my own memories for 5 years, and had 16 years had passed since my father had asked me to tell the story of Project Pegasus, which went all the way back to 1989, when I interviewed Al Bielek in 2005. He called me on the phone, and I had a couple chats with him, and I found out the following. One is that he had gone back to one of his previous employers and not known that he had worked there, which meant he was not in complete understanding of his own memories. Another thing I found is he only remembered his memories when he saw the Philadelphia Experiment, the movie, or Philadelphia Experiment, the movie, in 1984. I also found that when I distinguished the two interviews I did with Dr. Robert W. Beckwith, as well as the one-off interviews done by Alexandra Bruce and R. Kent Thomas of Dr. Beckwith, that Dr. Beckwith's discussion of the actual Philadelphia Experiment involving the USS Martha's Vineyard in August of 1943 in Long Island Sound differed from the story we were told in books and TV shows and movies about the so-called Philadelphia Experiment involving the USS Eldridge in Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. And that is the version that, before telling the story of the Kearsarge, Al Bielek told. He even confused teleportation and reincarnation when he stated that he jumped off the Eldridge and moved from being one of the Cameron brothers to his current identity as Al Bielek. So I'm sorry to say this to the late Al Bielek's friends and admirers, or those who have followed his work, but I believe he was a delusional individual. Now, he may have worked for Project Pegasus or some other classified project involving quantum access and then had his memories scrambled. But I think the evidence about Al Bielek shows that that did in fact happen to him at some time in his life. I did not encounter him when I was on Project Pegasus. I encountered Dr. Beckwith. Dr. Beckwith granted those 4 interviews, 2 to me, and then the one to Chica Bruce and Ken Thomas. And the Project Experiment cover story is the one that Al Bielek told, and then used it to conflate teleportation and reincarnation, which are not connected, except they resemble each other when you go through the tunnel and you go back to heaven. That's kind of like the vortal tunnel that we experienced teleporting. And also, he stated that people were getting to Mars via the Montauk chair. And I knew through my own experiences of the Montauk chair that all the Montauk chair does as a reverse engineered pilot seat from a downed UFO is send you to subjective moments in your own future. So if you go to Mars, like I did by aeronautical repositioning chamber, if those experiences were accessed in the past via Montauk chair, then you could use the Montauk chair to pre-experience those visits to the red planet. But Al confused the Montauk chair with literally the device that was getting people to Mars. So the bottom line is that Al Bielek's claims were not accurate. They showed evidence of somebody who did not do what he said. And he just kept on interpolating and spinning every new piece of material in the paranormal to kind of stay on top of his career as a lecturer. And he was pretty much a disturbed individual. I mean, one time he was asked at a conference, you're saying that all these people making these time travel claims as a mental patient has been mind controlled? Does that include you too, Al? And he turned about 180 degrees around and shook his head and said, yes, it does, and kind of smiled. So Al was not well, and I'm sorry to say that his impact on the truth about time travel has been a negative force that I've been trained to clean up now for almost 20 years. He was essentially a disturbed person who was not sharing authoritative information about the Philadelphia experiment, which actually did happen, but didn't involve radar invisibility of the Eldridge. It involved Tesla teleportation of the Martha's Vineyard. And then, as you just described, he then piled on that story from 1936. It was just not authoritative. They had been working on Tesla stuff from the time of Tesla's death on January 7th of 1943 forward, and that led to the first attempt to teleport one of our ships.
Okay, well, let's kind of look at this in terms of corroborating evidence. Al Bielek certainly has created a lot of waves in his testimony, but there have been other people who have come forward to confirm that indeed there were time travel experiments conducted out of Montauk. I certainly have interviewed a few people, Stuart Swerdlow for one, President Nichols. I've spoken to him. He also confirmed that there was this going on. I never spoke to Duncan Cameron, but others have spoken to him. And there have been other people who have confirmed Al Bielek's testimony that there were time travel experiments being run out of the Montauk project up there in Long Island, and that the Montauk chair was used to open up a space-time portal using psychics. So there have been multiple witnesses coming forward to confirm this.
I'm saying that.
Well, let me just
I encountered it earlier. I encountered it in 1970 before Project Montauk was launched. I've stated many times what I believe is the truth, which is that it would make sense to have a spin-off of the Montauk chair into a Project Montauk or a Project Looking Glass, as it were, with the chronovisors, but a Project Montauk with just the chair, because among the benefits were your body didn't go anywhere, and I know that we were getting very accurate information about the future via the Montauk chair. I just meant when Al spun it into a way to get to Mars, I was being sent to Mars, and we were not using the Montauk chair. I don't doubt what Preston and Duncan and others have said about Project Montauk. In fact, I've reified the likelihood that they did have have a spin-off of Project Pegasus consisting of Project Montauk. In fact, it would also make sense that Carl Jack Pruitt, U.S. Navy, born 1934, who I knew on the project, and I met as recently as 2003, would have been promoted from a team leader on Project Pegasus into the research director of Project Montauk. That would have been entirely consistent with the developmental timeline of these technologies. I was just discounting the accuracy of Al Bielek. I don't believe he should be looked upon as an authoritative source in this area.
Okay, well, there's some merit to that because Al Bielek and the others were they acknowledged that they had their minds wiped and that there was some mind control used on them to kind of like make it difficult for them to recall what had happened. So, there's a possibility of some kind of contamination or some embellishment.
Yes,
but at the same time, the fact
I was tortured to forget what I experienced.
Yeah.
And then we were constantly receiving the Soviet Leda machine every time we would come back from Mars. So when Al was quite a kind individual to contact me in 2005 after I'd begun lecturing, I am certainly grateful for him keeping alive public interest in the subject of time travel and reaching out to other chrononauts. That I would not disparage his memory for doing.
Okay.
I just meant that the net effect, whatever it was, whether it was delusion or mind wiping or whatever it was, that he was just sort of conflating everything being alleged and trying to relate it, and we can't do that in history.
Okay, well, let's kind of look at this in terms of his comments regarding the USS Kearsarge being involved in some kind of time travel experience back in 1936, and Navy ships from the future being taken back and forward in time to help the US Navy during the Second World War. Now, that was his claim, right? And so the thing is, okay, now, is that delusion? Was that based in fact? Well, I remember when I put out a segment talking about Bielek's claims regarding the Kearsarge, I got an email, and I think he'd be fine with me sharing this, from John Warner IV, the son of Senator John Warner. And he said that he attended a showing of the final of the movie, of the Hollywood movie, The Final Countdown, which was a blockbuster. I think it was Kirk Douglas and other A-list actors were in that, and that top Navy brass were present, and that they nodded their agreement with the film's premise that Navy ships were being sent back and forward in time to do various things, just as Bielek had claimed regarding the Kearsarge incident. Now, that's not to confirm that Bielek is exactly correct, but I'm saying that it's acknowledging that that Bielek's claim that ships such as the Kearsarge or other Navy ships have been sent back and forward in time by the US Navy to, whether it's to gather intel, whether it's to change the timeline or nudge it in a certain way, and that John Warner was kind of like sending me that nice piece of intel confirming that, this is going on, and that the Navy does acknowledge that this kind of movement of Navy ships is occurring.
Right, and when I interviewed Robert Beckwith in that time period, this again was around 2005, 2006, I think he would die in 2009 at age 89. We discussed that. So now what I'm talking about addressing is the developmental timeline. Because look, when they tried to teleport the Martha's Vineyard on August 12th, 1983, they had that huge electrostatic discharge that caused that one sailor, when the ship was brought back, not from Norfolk, Virginia, but Newport News, Virginia, and was then again in Long Island Sound, there was one sailor impaled through the midsection by a column of the splash scaling of the vessel. So that was the first attempt to apply Tesla teleportation to our naval ships to avoid Nazi mines that the Nazi Navy had chained to the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. So that was August of 1943. There may have been something tried earlier involving the Kearsarge. I just never heard that, and Dr. Beckwith never discussed that earlier attempt to implement Tesla teleportation during, 7 years before Tesla's death in 1936. So I think that might have been Al just trying to embellish what had already been told, because we do have a fairly stable data point in historiographic terms involving what I remember people talking about on Project Pegasus when I was a child, and then what Dr. Beckwith confirmed when I was already over 40 years old, and what he told Alexander Bruce and Ken Thomas. So I think that the basic point made by John Warner IV about the fact that the U.S. Navy and the U.S. Air Force are teleporting ships and planes has been revealed. It's what Dr. Beckwith shared with me, and I released in around, I guess it was around 2006. It may have been 2009 after his death. So that's true. I'm not sure it really matters, because there could have been a previous attempt when Tesla was still alive that has not really been supported very much by other principals in this area. But clearly, it was something that was, August of 1943 was when the war was still on. So we also know that if we're to believe what Dr. Beckwith shared with me, that I certainly published by 2009, then that means that by the present at that time, 2005, 2006, they had learned how to teleport a big, heavy metal airplane or naval vessel and not have that a huge electrostatic discharge. So that problem would have had to been solved to do what Beckwith was claiming was operational by 2005. And he actually told me that the jets that bombed Kosovo for President Clinton took off at Edwards Air Force Base in California, went up, turned their teleporters on, teleported to Kosovo, turned their teleporters off, dropped their bombs, turned around, turned their teleporters back on, and had lunch that day at their homes near Edwards Air Force Base. He also stated that he was aboard a ship, a U.S. naval vessel, anchored in Tampa, Florida, and the captain showed him the implement there on the hull of the vessel to flip, to relocate the ship somewhere else on the surface of the ocean. So that was claimed by 2005 that they had essentially resolved how to teleport a heavy, large metallic object like a ship or a plane and not have that huge, disastrous electrostatic discharge that led to that catastrophe during the original Philadelphia experiment, and that we had to watch when we were just little kids teleporting across the country. You may remember the story I've been sharing that one time one of the other boys in the program with me, David, left a coin in his pocket, and by the time we got to New Mexico, it had gotten so hot and was vibrating so much that it shot out of his pocket and burned his cuff. And I was later told by my father that if that had hit us, it would have killed us. So electrostatic discharge was going on in the program. I mean, when I first teleported with my dad, our mutual hair was floating all over the place from it. I just tend to doubt the story about the Kearsarge because that challenges the historicity of what we remember about the actual Philadelphia experiment in Long Island Sound involving the Martha's Vineyard.
Okay, well, definitely it's an issue that needs to be investigated more. The Montauk guys, they have their history that has come forward, and certainly we need more information to confirm which of these accounts is more accurate. And but what I wanted to do to just kind of wrap it up is that, so you finished your involvement in the Pegasus project in 1972, and then in 1979 I think that you began to get involved in this Mars jump room. So we can talk about that next interview if we can do a repeat or a third interview. But what happened in between from 1972 to 79? You're 11 years old. I mean, you go through, finish high school, start college. I mean, what happened?
What happened was, when I left Project Pegasus at the end of the summer of 72, they took me to a military office in New Jersey, and they put these large needles all the way up my spine, from my coccyx to all the way up to the back of my neck. And they infused my spine and my head with this unspeakably severe headache, saying this is how I would feel whenever I thought about my experiences on Project Pegasus. And I thought what they were doing, and I was telling myself, no matter how painful this gets, as they had me recount everything that happened over the last 4 years. And by the way, that was, in real time, that was 1968 to 72, but in time travel, that was 68 all the way back to 100 million BC, and then also we had gone forward from 1971 to 73, and now I was back in 1972 after having visited 2045, et cetera, et cetera. So I was telling myself, as they were essentially torturing me to forget what I had done in the program, I will not forget. I don't know whether my dad knew about those activities. He tended to believe that I was not telling the truth or was delusional when I had said that they were shocking us after we would come back to Curtis Wright via teleportation by putting a plastic tongue depressor in our mouth and giving us about 30 seconds of vigorous electrical shocking in this kind of halo they put around our temple. He thought he had been told they weren't doing that, when in fact they were doing that. So I've described how my dad never would have permitted that. He would have viewed that as abusive, as well as what was done to me in that medical lab, in terms of literally using the induction of pain or trauma-based mind control, if you will, to try to get me to forget what had happened to me over the past 4 or 5 years. Now, I know who that person was. I'm not free to state who that person was because I don't want to be sued. But that person has come forward to deny his involvement in Project Mars and Project Pegasus. So one of the things he's concealing is that he was involved in trauma-based mind control. But basically I was subjected to that. Then we moved to, then I met my fiancée, Gwen Coleman, in Santa Fe in summer of 72. And all 4 of my surviving older siblings would be available to testify that nope, Andy never was in New Mexico until fall of 72. Well, then how did Gwen cross paths with my father and I in Santa Fe in summer of 72? We even have the name of her brother's then girlfriend that she was with when I asked her as we were crossing them in Santa Fe, why do they call it a halter? And she turned and said to me, that's for me to know and for you to find out. And my dad kind of chuckled. So she remembers that brief encounter in Santa Fe. Then in 72, I crossed the country by a car with my 6 older family members, my parents and my 4 older siblings. And I went to junior high, high school, and college in Chatsworth, California. Did extremely well in high school, National Merit Scholar, most likely to succeed and most respected out of 1,000 graduating seniors. I won a number of journalism prizes. I won the National Council Teachers of English Achievement Award in Writing, and so edited my school paper. And I went to UC San Diego for a year, my freshman year. And my father said, son, you're going to have to transfer to UCLA. And I said, why, Dad? And he said, because we're going to be doing something up here. Now, the reason that that was necessary was that the jump room to Mars was at 999 North Sepulveda, right down the San Diego Freeway, the 405, from Westwood, California, and the location of the UCLA campus. And that's where I would be jumping to Mars. So I had to transfer to UCLA, which I did, and I entered in fall of 1980. But before then, I had a 3.5 week training course in going to Mars, taught by Major Ed Ames at College of the Siskiyous in Weed, California, with William Brett Stilling, Elvira Dugan, William Cameron McCool, Bernie Mendez, and a young man going to Occidental College from Indonesia named Barry Sotoro, who would run for president after changing his name a few years later, around 1983, to Barack Hussein Obama. And that is a true story, and we only shared it not because he was the sitting president, but because he was one of our fellow Mars astronauts. And we thought, well, if we don't reveal that the president was one of our colleagues in the program, if that's discovered by a brilliant researcher like yourself, Michael, then they'll hold that as a threat to the validity of what we've been stating. So we simply told the truth that Mr. Obama was one of our colleagues in Project Mars, and he was.
Well, that's a great way to end this interview, because it sets up the next interview where we're going to look into the Mars jump room and what happened in that. So, Andy, is there anything you want to say to my audience? It's been a month since you were last on Exopolitics Today, in terms of what you're doing or what you're working on, or if people wanted to contact you.
Well, anybody can reach me by researching my phone number through the Washington State Bar Association.org website, WSBA.org, if they want. I would urge anybody to place a call to me if they have an original question, or to place that question with you. I want everybody to know that my books are finished, both my memoirs of Project Pegasus and Project Mars. And I've also written a trilogy about my paranormal experiences since birth that have nothing to do with time travel or going to Mars, as well as a book about my afterlife memories, which I've had my whole life. I basically have been an experiencer my entire life. And so I'm basically going to share my belief that our spirits do not die, even though our bodies do, and that we're all on the path to ascension. And I think that's a very hopeful thing to reflect on. I will share information I've shared since I was 9 years old, for the last 51 years, about specific people that I remember being. These include the name of a very unusual first name in America that hired me to serve as one of the first professors at Amherst College, a small town in Sweden that I never should have heard of when I was born of a Swedish person's life, and I'll tell who that was. In fact, that was the only prominent person I was, Don Hammarskjöld, in all of my past life memories. And then I came up with the name of a rare musical instrument used in India before the Raj. I was just a simple merchant. So what I'm saying is, I present evidence in this book of things about times and places that they should have no access to. And I also share the fact, in fact, my chapter 8 or so in my memoir, Project Pegasus, was being regressed to one past life in Project Pegasus, after the Department of Defense told us that we shouldn't worry about losing our lives time traveling for the U.S. government in Project Pegasus. Because if we did, we would go back to heaven, review our life, and then be born again. That's the nature of reality. So I share that in the Pegasus memoir, and then I use that and contextualize that at the beginning of my, not my memories, but my exposure to past life regression in my Afterlife book. So that's one of the reasons I'm speaking out. It's my belief that the United States was supposed to be the fulfillment of the Enlightenment, and it's my understanding, based on what I was told and what I was involved in DARPA's Project Pegasus, that the U.S. government has concealed things like the eternity of the human soul, survival after death, and the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth, after proving them through extrinsic scientific and technical processes that I and my father were involved in. So that's why I kind of decided to finish out these 6 critical works with something about my afterlife memories. And that's all been done. And I don't doubt any of the conspiracy theories we discussed today, including those involving the Kennedy assassinations. I want everybody to know that I've been researching such issues since I was a teenager and writing about them.
Let's
gave an interview.
Well,
to Louis Perdue of the Washington Post when I was in college about serving Project Pegasus 10 years earlier. That interview has to be found. People have mentioned to me they remember reading it in the Post, but I want to find it in the Washington Post. That hasn't been achieved yet.
Well,
just as the appearance of the Josephine Cobb image in a news magazine in the early 70s, going back to the early 50s, has not yet been achieved. We found it in the National Geographic, circa like 1963, but not the early 70s.
Well, we definitely will have an opportunity to touch on the Kennedy assassination again, and the spirit and the afterlife and the resurrection, or Jesus and the crucifixion and the cover-up of that incident in terms of information. So these are things that we will cover in future interviews. So I just want to encourage listeners, if you do have a question for Andy, you could always just email me, and I can ask it during one of these follow-up interviews. Next interview, we're going to be talking about the Mars jump room. So specifically, if you have any questions about what Andy has said in the past regarding the Mars jump room, then definitely send that to me at drsala@exopolitics.org. So Andy, I want to thank you again for a really informative and rich interview, and all the best.
Thank you, Michael, and as always, we shall know the truth, and it shall set us free.
You have been listening to Exopolitics Today with Dr. Michael Salla. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Join or start a conversation in the comments. Take the time to explore the vast library of best-selling books, webinars, and podcasts by Dr. Salla. Visit exopoliticstoday.com.